speaking for the Eastern States Archaeology Federation, or not speaking for them, but from the perspective of the Eastern States.
Did you hear that, Yusuf? This is your voice coming through the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast.
Exactly.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reinick and Ken Holyoke.
Welcome back to the Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reinick in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and I'm joined, as I am just about every fortnight, by Ken Holyoke in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
I'm doing very well, Gabe, and I'm set up in the office today. It's the semester is over, and spring has sprung here, although apparently we're getting snow again tonight. But
oh, wonderful. Yeah. And so, Ken, are you still in Canada?
I am. I can report that we have not yet proceeded to the madness that might be happening this fall. So luckily there's a court injunction right now waylaying some of the efforts of, my son described them as the people who are trying to sell Lethbridge.
Well, Ken, I mean, at least if they do separate, maybe you'll be able to get commercial aircraft back in Lethbridge, because most countries want to have their own airline. Well, so you might have like Lethbridge Air.
Yeah. Danielle Smith Air.
Yes.
I'm sure that it just rolls off the tongue.
Exactly. And so, again, speaking of international stuff, we've got an exciting episode coming up about the St. Croix site.
Yeah, which is not just international. It is an international historic site and also basically the dividing line for an international border.
That's right. And we're going to be joined by Steve Pendery for a very exciting episode. And we should say at the outset here, there's some images that Steve Pendery uses in that show, and we are going to, but we will plug them in to, I believe, the YouTube channel, right?
Yeah. So for the listener, this might be an opportunity for you to check out the YouTube version of this episode, because Steve was kind enough to provide us with some images of maps and some excavation photos as well, wasn't it? Showing some of the archaeological work that's gone on in St. Croix, but also some of the historical mapping. For example, how Champlain mapped out the settlement. And actually, if the listener looks very closely over my my left shoulder, right there, is actually one of the maps that he's going to be talking about.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm sure the listener can't see that because I can't see that. so I see a Kachina doll.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, there are those as well. So
yes. Okay. Well, that's
for a different show.
Yes, but Ken, as I've mentioned here, the things are getting, potentially by the time this drops, very international. But are pretty international on this show. Even at the most normal of times. And so one of the things that you and I have discussed is that it's possible that the name for this show does not really capture all the stuff that we cover on this show. Wouldn't you agree?
That's right. Yep. In the coming episodes, in fact, we're going to be defining the border between New Brunswick and Maine, but then also leaving New Brunswick and leaving the continent for a brief visit overseas.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, wouldn't you agree that whether or not Lethbridge gets sold, as your son puts it, you and I are personally committed to integrity about not just stealing other people's intellectual property?
Right. That is correct. Yes, we would always respect your IP, and we would never
send in a new name.
Yeah, and we would never attempt to get some kind of referendum on the validity of your name that you've suggested, or a referendum to try to take that name.
No, not at all. We would remunerate the lucky listener who renamed this podcast.
That is correct.
Yeah. And Ken, are you familiar with Zumba?
Is this the dance exercise?
That's right, Ken. It's the Colombian dance craze, invented in 2001, that merges cardio with Latin dance. It's known to melt away calories, lower blood pressure, and increase good cholesterol, all to fun Latin rhythms. And Ken, Zumba may be healthy, but there's a key form with Zumba as a form of exercise, and that's that it neglects the importance of the upper body, particularly arm strength. So not only is it banned in Iran for being un-Islamic, it also means that, in effect, every day is just leg day. And so we want to get a better kind of exercise here. And Ken, that's why you and I here at the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, we prefer a dance craze that employs even more ancient modalities. That's right, Ken. Are you familiar with Morris dancing?
Morris dancing?
That's right. Are you familiar with it?
I am not, no.
Oh, well, Ken, it's a form of English folk dance that originated in the 15th century. That's right. It's a late woodland form of folk dance.
There you go.
And the way it works is the groups of dancers, called Morris sides, dress up in white suits, they tie bells around their shins, and they dance around rhythmically to music entitled things like Old Hog or None. And As I Was Going to Banbury, which is played on a melodeon, which kind of looks like an accordion, or on a recorder.
I think
but it's not all jingling.
Called Midsummer that featured this in the last couple of years.
Yes. Well, it's exactly. We're coming to something like that. But it's not all jingling, Ken. The dancers also swing around wooden clubs, and occasionally they strike them together rhythmically. And then periodically a dancer called the Fool, who's dressed up in a sort of hoodless onesie with neck frills and carrying a yet still bigger stick, will come running through the fray to enhance the chaos and the danger. That's right, Ken. Not only will you be getting cardio and improving your upper arm strength, but your hand-eye coordination too. And now, Ken, you may be thinking that this sounds like a particularly kinky sequel to The Wicker Man, but that would neglect the community-building joy that the listener will get by stepping into a communal form of folk dancing that's developed over hundreds of years. Far from being an orgiastic frenzy representing the basis of human emotion and mysterious pagan rituals, Morris scholar Catherine Robert Parker writes, it's community building, it's political activism, it's controversial, and it's connected to the natural environment. And Ken, we wouldn't just send the listener out unequipped while the accordion tears into Bonnie Green garters. No, Ken, we'll be also giving the listener a full set of brass-plated 15mm, that's .03 barleycorns, bells, white bell pads, plain toe wrapper shoes, a complete set of white hankies, white suit, white fedora, an official multicolored NB ArcPod multicolored vest with tassel, and a fully seasoned hazel stick. That's right, Ken. You're going to be ready to Morris on once you get this prize pack from the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. And Ken, where would the new Lucky Morris person with a name for this very podcast send that name?
They would send that to newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. That's New Brunswick Archaeology, all one word, spelled archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY, newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com.
That's right. And Ken, if you reach into that mailbag, is there anything in it?
We do not have any emails from listeners in our mailbag. We appear to have a new message on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm. And while you're looking for that, Ken, I'll tell the listener that also using that mailbag or Instagram or LinkedIn, if the listener donates some money to the CAA Scholarship Fund, if they donate at least $25 to the CAA Scholarship Fund and send us a screenshot of the receipt, we will send them a limited edition New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast apron while quantities last. We are down to the teens of them, so it's first come, first served. But we would love to get those out to folks who are willing to donate to a great cause and share proof of having done so with us.
Yeah. So it said we had a message, but I don't see it. We're getting lots of post impressions on LinkedIn. That's what a lot of emails are. We also got an email. Oh, I don't know why we got this, but we got an email from University Press, Florida, advertising a new book called Revenant Waste, Mill Creek and the Toxic Legacies of the Anthropocene by Hayden E. Stewart. So we've ended up on the mailing list.
We should get Hayden on. He's kind of a buddy. I know him a bit.
Oh, actually, I do know this guy. Yeah.
You've met Hayden.
Yeah, he was at Gary's thing.
That's right. Yes. Oh. Yes, that's right. Yes. He was.
Yeah, there's a picture of him down at the bottom of this email. Yeah.
Well, we should have him on to discuss his book.
I guess so. Yeah. Interesting.
Okay. Well, I'll make a note to reach out to Hayden.
Totally. Yeah. It's a book about using archaeology to unearth the lingering effects of capitalism at one of Western Canada's first industrial sites.
That actually sounds pretty relevant for us.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. Okay. Well, congratulations, Hayden. And thank you for reaching out to us through University Press of Florida.
Yeah, that's great. And Ken, if the lucky listener, or not the lucky listener, if any listener wants to email us, where would they do that?
They would do that to newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. That is New Brunswick Archaeology, all one word, archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY, newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at new_Brunswick_archaeology, and that is archaeology spelled the same way. And we are also on LinkedIn. Just go to linkedin.com and type in New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast in the search, and you will find our episode, as well as links to past episodes, video clips, and some information about our contest that Gabe had just told you about.
That's right. And well, Ken, should we head over to the St. Croix site?
I think we should.
All right. Today we're joined by Dr. Stephen Pendery. Dr. Pendery was educated at Brown and Harvard universities. He has extensive experience in Northeast archaeology, including as director of UMass Amherst Archaeological Services, acting Northeast Regional Archaeologist for the National Park Service, and as the City Archaeologist for Boston. He has an extensive publication record in historical archaeology, including co-editing the 2024 collection Historical Archaeology, Colonial and Post-Colonial Consequences. Other publications have appeared in such journals as Proceedings of the International Association for Caribbean Archaeology, Northeast Historical Archaeology, and numerous edited volumes and proceedings. His recent research has focused on Acadian diaspora sites and early French colonization in the Caribbean. Today, however, he's joining us to discuss a great site, St. Croix Island, about which he edited the volume St. Croix Island, Maine, History, Archaeology, and Interpretation, which was released in 2012 by the Maine Archaeological Society. Thank you so much for joining us today, Steve.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
St. Croix Island sits on the St. Croix River between Washington County, Maine, and Charlotte County, New Brunswick. And to set a historical baseline, the listener is likely going to know about St. Croix Island from Champlain. So let's start there. Could you tell us a little bit about Champlain and Pierre Duguay's 1604 year at St. Croix?
First, a little bit about the location and size of St. Croix Island. It is located in the middle of the St. Croix River, a little bit east of the international boundary. And to quote David Hackett Fisher, it is a very small island, barely 300 yards long and 100 yards wide, or about 6 acres in size. It's a photograph of the island, an aerial view. So this location was very consequential for its early colonial period history. The settlement itself, a European settlement, represents the earliest of 2 successive outposts leading to the permanent European occupation and colonization of New France. And it served as a home base for surveying and mapping, resulting in the first accurate maps of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and New England. St. Croix was a setting not just for the physical mapping of the region, which Champlain actually did quite a bit of during this day, but also mapping out the strategy for colonization efforts that played out over the following years and decades. And so this island has a number of firsts, and that's one way to remember it, that it contains, for example, North America's earliest dated European cemetery. I'll get back to that in a little bit. It was the first location and setting for the application of the methods of historical archaeology to serve specific research problems. Now, it's not as though this was the earliest French settlement in the New World, because there's a whole flurry of settlements involved in the 16th century, as far south as Rio de Janeiro, Charles Fort in South Carolina, and Fort Caroline in Florida. But as it turned out, France became embroiled in religious wars, again, between Catholics and Huguenots. And during the reign of Francis I, these monarchs were pretty much distracted by what was happening and not concentrating on colonization, whereas England, Spain didn't have these issues. Under Henry IV, by the late 1590s, explorations were renewed, and cod fishing and fur trade had probably continued all during this time period in the North Atlantic. There was, in fact, a short-lived trading post called Tadoussac that was established on the St. Lawrence River in about 1600 or so. So that was the first effort that was like a trial there to see if that strategy would work out. And so Pierre Dugas, or Sieur Dumont, and a supporter of Henry IV, was appointed lieutenant governor of New France, which was a huge area back at this period. So in 1604, an expedition was put together. Dugas was accompanied by Samuel Champlain, a navigator, geographer, cartographer, and it's mainly through Champlain's writings and illustrations that we have such detailed information on this event. So you could ask then, what's the purpose of archaeology if we know so much and we have these great plans? Well, not surprisingly, I guess, in today's political atmosphere, we hear a lot about Champlain's own accomplishments to the point of deflecting credit to the Sieur Dugas, who actually was the primary mover and shaker of this effort to colonize New France. We can't forget Marc Lescarbot and Pierre Biard, who also contributed documentation of the early years of St. Croix Island, so that those who might be recognized as historians made inquiries about what had happened at St. Croix Island before their time. So it's a very richly documented site. But I don't want to leave anyone out in this, because quite clearly this expedition landed right in the middle of Passamaquoddy territory. And this was another area where Champlain honed his skills in negotiating his needs with Native Americans that served him. And, well, for what it was worth, the effort to colonize New France in the following years. So this was sort of is a long answer to your question, but it wasn't just an area for his mapping of the region, which he accomplished quite a bit of. But one result was sort of a better understanding of the limitations of putting a settlement on an island in the middle of a river, especially during the winter time. Now, although this was clearly driven by defensive needs, the island itself lacked a fresh water source, necessitating frequent travel across this river that was often frozen over. So this clearly had an impact on the diet. 35 European settlers died, some of them by scurvy. Symptoms of scurvy were documented by Champlain. But our explorations in the early 2020s and described in our 2012 report helped to confirm the issue with scurvy, or the lack of sources of vitamin C, including the lack of fresh meat for many of the residents there. And of course, that sort of leads us to then very quickly to the area of the study of diet here, because we kind of have a controlled group. We have a pretty good idea of who these French individuals were, where they were from in France, and what their social status was. So these are variables that factor into our discussion of diet, because the site is so richly documented. There are other reasons the site's important, and in my opinion, it's a great opportunity. It's always been a location for the blending of tribal peoples, of Europeans, Canadians, Americans, that we can share some common ground and interact, learning more about this failed settlement. And so I look forward to describing a little bit more about it, but I think you have another question coming up.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you said even in this kind of intro that I kind of wanted to pull on, and the first was this element of geography. And so they chose an island in the middle of a river without a fresh water source. And when I was reading Eric Thierry's chapter, kind of framing, it reminded me of the Sam White book, A Cold welcome, sort of talking about the European exploration of North America during the Little Ice Age, and how the French, much the same as many of their European counterparts, had this sort of flawed interpretation of latitudes and what their expectations were for like weather conditions, right? And so part of the selection of St. Croix and kind of the oversight of how bad the winter would be was a result from the climate when they arrived, but also kind of misinterpretation about what the winter would be like generally, right? Their access to the mainland and what the weather would be like when they arrived.
Yeah, well, this is most likely a consequence of getting your information from French fishing fleets that go over during the spring, summer, and return before the winter.
Yeah, it's a world of bounty over there.
For the most part, that for them staying around here during the winter time. So, and as we have witnessed, I can verify this winter has been very and still is unpredictable. I'm keeping my snow shovel, just right outside the front door. And this is normally considered to be pretty late in the year for snow in the Boston area. So you never really know. And they also apparently, based on sort of retrospective weather, sort of studies, believe that winter of 1604 or 1605 was particularly bad.
Yeah. Even for wine country like Calais, Maine, it was bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you also brought up an element about Champlain kind of gets the recognition and the Sieur de Monts is sort of sidelined, but and you brought up Champlain's maps, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later. But we have a colleague who Arthur Anderson, who's written about Champlain's cartography and how he visualized different areas of North America. So the map of Saco Harbor that shows villages and cornfields and that kind of thing. And based on the archaeology, and again, I might be jumping ahead here, do we get a sense that Champlain's maps of St. Croix and of the habitation itself are fairly accurate representations of what it looked like?
This is a great question, and it's relevant not just to the study of Champlain, but to the study of probably any documented history that's out there from any time period. When it comes to Champlain, I was just thinking today about, what was the process of bringing his illustrations to the stage of publication? And that quite clearly the hand that etched the plates was not of Champlain. It was of some master engraver in some part of France who was putting together the book. So that was the individual who made judgments about what to show, what not to show, maybe drawing notions just out of the air, or maybe from other sources. There were conventions in terms of how you depicted certain characteristics of the landscape that people would recognize. So it's highly symbolic, and so I think it's best to look at Champlain's illustrations, which for the most part survive as engravings that illustrated his volumes. That we have to keep all that in mind, and it has its own set of problems. This is sort of one of the most interesting aspects of historical archaeology, and that is having two different sources of evidence to work with, and that our expectations that they should overlap and become the same happens very infrequently. And I have to say that, let's say prior to 1900 or so, that the only situations where I found anything close to a one-to-one correlation is between archaeological evidence for 19th century urban sites and the Sanborn or Bromley atlas maps showing those same areas. Those were fire insurance atlas maps that were commissioned. There were large businesses that did this. And it was extremely important because losses through fire and having, and being paid through insurance premiums it was serious business. So there was an incentive for these maps to be absolutely accurate. In fact, we used them at one time. I was, I directed a lot of the big dig archaeology in Boston when the highway system was reconstructed, that we used those maps to predict where sites were located in heavily bulldozed areas. And I would say they were accurate down to a foot. Now, that's not what we're talking about here. To get back to another first, that St. Croix Island was actually the first real kind of historical archaeology site to be worked on, certainly in North America, possibly all of the Americas, where it was going out and digging something up to obtain information that was not readily available elsewhere. This is a well-documented example of it from the 1790s. I'll describe it a little bit more later on, but it's this idea that documents aren't everything, and sometimes you need to go out and actually take measurements of something physical out in the landscape to answer your question.
Perfect.
That's great.
Well, we certainly look forward to returning to that topic too. Can you tell us a little bit about your own research engagement with St. Croix, how you ended up to be working there, and what the goals of that work were?
Yes. Let's see. Well, it started off when I was a teenager, and I was living in France and was interested in archaeology. So one area where they would accept people like me right off the streets was in working on medieval and post-medieval sites, because they were good. They were a dime a dozen in France. They weren't assigned any particular significance. So I worked at mostly fortifications in Alsace, in that area. But I became acquainted with fortifications across France and throughout Europe. And so I always had an interest in French material culture from that period. But when I came to the United States, I mainly studied archaeology sort of in New England, which largely was sort of Anglophone oriented. And that was fine, because that was coming into its own at that time, and I had wonderful opportunities to learn quite a bit about it. But around year 2000, I switched over to French colonialism and have since been looking at French colonial sites, both in South America, Caribbean, North America. I do have to give credit to a native of New Brunswick, though, who really got the ball rolling with researching the physical St. Croix Island, and that's William Gagnon, a native of New Brunswick who later taught at Smith College in Massachusetts, and that he translated the critical document, Champlain's book Les Voyages, and conducted really the first what we call archaeological reconnaissance survey of the island itself. And getting back to sort of why all this business about St. Croix Island, well, it has to do with the setting of the international boundary. I'll discuss that a little bit more later. But St. Croix Island just happened to fall inside territorial United States, so it was designated a national monument in 1949, and in 1984 is the only international historic site in the U.S. park system. So I happen to have been an archaeologist, sort of an acting regional archaeologist in the national park system in the United States. It was a great opportunity, had a wide range of different types of sites, but I was thrilled to discover that St. Croix Island was within our region. And so I confess I pay particular attention to the needs of this resource, because I think I did realize how, we can talk unique here, how unique a resource it was. So administratively, it falls within this region. It's a mixed blessing, because the region has benefited from the involvement of a wide range of different types of archaeologists. And on the other hand, the regional center for the Northeast region has alternately been, well, for the most part, it's been Philadelphia, a long ways from the park, and from many of the other parks administered out of that. And I can talk about that a little bit, but specifically, St. Croix Island came to my attention when I became concerned, when I learned that there are human remains in boxes in storerooms, both down in Philadelphia and at our labs located in Lowell, Massachusetts. And that a fitting project to mark the 400th anniversary of the settlement by Europeans of St. Croix Island would be to return these human remains to their original locations, to where they had been removed. Now, we had a determination made that they did not fall under NAGPRA, Native American Graves Repatriation Act. So we basically followed the same maybe idea of respect for human remains that you see in NAGPRA, and that we consulted with, I believe we consulted with the French, certainly with our Canadian compatriots. And so this was accomplished. This was the main goal of the project, but during this time, it involved the transportation of artifacts from the island to Acadia National Park, or sort of focusing more attention on these artifacts and their meaning. And at that point, I felt that previous analyses were really inaccurate. They were not up to date with work taking place in France. And during this long period, especially after 2000, medieval and post-medieval archaeology has been more important in France. It's not for academic reasons. It's for cultural resource management reasons, where if you have a construction site, then where do you draw the line between something that's significant or not significant? And so I would say the French have really pulled into the forefront of post-medieval archaeology. And as a result of that, we have wonderful site reports on World War I and even World War II sites. So they bring significance right up to modern times, which is great. And certainly, so this has resulted in additional attention paid to sites such as pottery production sites, metallurgy, other areas of craft production. And it's these remains that we find in the area that was known as New France. And so that information then feeds back into the analysis of these sites. So it was kind of exciting for me to be involved in that.
Yeah. Are you following the French CRM literature? That sounds incredibly challenging. I mean, following the North American CRM literature. Is it easier to find over there?
It's incredible stuff. I mean, you do have to be selective following, your interests, but I made it my business to closely follow the excavations of the courtyard of the Louvre Museum in Paris. And this was before the pyramid was constructed there, which is the main entrance. By the way, it's now obsolete. There are too many people that want to find their way into the Louvre Museum, so they're going to have to come up with a different idea. But the first time around, they figured they would have an underground entrance in the courtyard, and they dug down. Well, they found a whole castle that they knew was there, but until they physically encountered it, I don't think it. So, that set that project back a few years while they excavated the castle. But I was there, and I worked with some of the people in the storerooms looking at the material as it was coming out.
Cool.
And this was compared, directly with what was coming out of St. Croix Island.
That's very cool. Yeah. So that's the thing is St. Croix Island, did it have this sort of typical French material culture signature and like your familiarity with the French? I wrote down a quote here when I was reading through the book that St. Croix was described as a proper little Norman village transplanted to Acadia. And so, was the material culture that you guys found there representative of that? And what were the artifacts and features like? Did it really look like they transposed a small area of northwestern France into an island between Maine and New Brunswick?
Well, there's some interesting features there that, in terms of the cartography, I think that this is an area where one could take Champlain's maps and this issue of let's say, editing or revising them for publication have to be taken seriously. Quite clearly, in one case, the island itself is reshaped to fit a rectangular engraving plate. So the island is, clearly is misrepresented.
I found that in GIS myself, actually.
So it would fit on the page, so have to take that into account. But in many cases, we do have measurements, and I found those useful. So I independently kind of mapped out the settlement. And to answer your question, I would say that it's a reconfiguration of elements that one would encounter in the French landscape, and having a kind of a larger open square, which would be reminiscent of, let's say, a marketplace. Now, right. I doubt very much you'd have
wasn't super active
French
in the
marketplace. However, it's remotely possible that the notion was that this would be an enduring settlement, and that someday there would be a marketplace there.
Right.
So that's quite possible. Functionally, though, I don't think it was quite at that point. But what's also intriguing, exploring Champlain's principal map of the St. Croix settlement, is that there's an aristocratic house, distinctive by its roof, by its location, and that clearly was Dumont's house. And
right.
They had an aristocrat there. And so getting back to the question about, let's say, the artifact assemblage, it was striking to me. It was very different from what I had encountered in France. And the reason was that it seemed very utilitarian. A high percentage of the ceramic wares were these stoneware jars. And I think I have a picture of these things would often, and they have handles not so much for pouring, but for just moving the jars around, because they'd usually be filled with salted or dried meat.
Okay.
And so we see a lot of that, and probable reuse of these jars, possibly for water, because they had to transport their water to the island if they were not able to capture enough rain and find it from other sources. So it was kind of a clunky, not very glamorous artifact assemblage. We quantified all this, of course, but a relatively low percentage of what we would consider, I wouldn't even call them aristocratic, but lead glazed earthenware was scarce. But these large stoneware containers were quite common. And we're looking at basically a maritime expedition that lands on an island, and where maybe the maritime lifestyle continues on the island. I mean, there they are, out in the middle of the water, and the island is kind of shaped like a large boat. So perhaps what had served them well, getting across the ocean, continued to serve them while they were more or less stuck on this island in the middle of the river.
They had kind of a somewhat harrowing arrival to North America too. Like they got split up for a time and kind of had to break off into different sort of different expeditions to get them to St. Croix, basically.
That's how they lost the orange juice, Ken.
Yeah. Well, and they lost a sheep, and so I hadn't realized, hadn't remembered Gabe. So Gabe and I did a field project when he was doing his master's in Port Jolly, and I always loved driving through Port Mattoon, and being able to put that into context of the St. Croix expedition was fun. So.
Well, there were these expeditions. There would be at least 2 ships going across, and inevitably they'd be split up at one point or another. So there was always a rendezvous point that was designated along the eastern coast of North America. And so those were the areas that could be populated at one point. Whether St. Croix Island was going to serve that role, hard to tell, but it did have a distinctive location a place that'd be relatively easy to find again. But this also applied to the 16th century settlements, and I should just mention in passing the Cap Rouge, the Cartier-Roberval site, which was discovered a little bit less than 20 years ago, a little bit south of Quebec City. And that was used in the early 1540s, as I recall. And that also, the expeditions which led to that settlement did split up, and so that was not an uncommon situation. And apparently the word got around where people were. We have to remember that these fishing fleets, not only French, but English, Dutch, maybe even Hispanic, maybe even Portuguese, that they'd be out there. So the word got around quickly who was where.
So you've touched on some of this already, but and you've also touched a bit about this in terms of just historical archaeology and disconnect between the archaeological record and the historical record. But what kind of contributions to understanding St. Croix Island did the archaeological work make? And even more so, to what degree does St. Croix Island help us understand those early French habitations here in North America?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, St. Croix Island is full of firsts in European colonization, and then in the methods used to study it hundreds of years later. In part, this is because of its early date and relatively excellent level of preservation. Archaeology has yielded tangible evidence for many of these firsts, several of which are forensic in nature. For example, contains the earliest documented European cemetery in the Americas. So that means that we can use the historical controls to identify, in general, the group that was there. And certainly through DNA and other analyses, which may not even have been developed yet, we may be able to track these individuals down to, where they were, where they're from in Europe. We also have the earliest physical evidence for scurvy among North American colonists. And again, although Champlain and Dugas were not familiar with the term, they did recognize the symptoms because this is something that affected these long expeditions across the Atlantic. We also have the earliest evidence for autopsied individuals quite clearly here. And again, something that's referenced in Champlain's narrative, Les Voyages, from 1613. But we actually encountered the skull of an autopsied individual. When we were conducting the reburial project that we opened up, we had to expose most of the elements of a skeleton in order to return certain elements to their proper location. And in doing so, we discovered that an individual who had been excavated by Jacob Gruber, who was a national park, well, he had been hired by the National Park Service as an archaeologist to do this work. Well, he didn't recognize that the skull had been sawn in half. So so we re-excavated it and discovered this. And it was really pretty remarkable. So we can look at, we have done a demographic survey looking at age at the time of death, also the health conditions, and so that we could substantiate some of Champlain's observations and go a little bit further. And I think this is probably the most valuable aspect of looking at some of these early sites. And it's there is an opportunity to be a little bit creative in developing hypotheses. Again, taking some comments by Champlain and linking it to physical evidence in the ground, that Champlain noticed himself that there was a better health outcome for the mostly aristocratic members of the expedition, who instead of kind of feeling sorry for themselves, moping around, hanging out inside their stuffy buildings, these individuals would go out and hunt. And hunting was something that aristocrats knew a lot about, especially hunting wild game. Whereas, the average dock worker in Saint-Nazaire or some port in France may not know the first thing about hunting wild animals. So it seems that there may be a link between their aristocratic background, hunting, and a better health outcome. And of course, we have the evidence from Champlain and Dugas themselves. They survived all this, whereas up to 35 of their crew did not survive that first winter.
And
so Champlain was really the first,
crew, right? Or almost exactly half their crew?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
So Champlain was really the earliest fitness influencer, but back in the 17th century. So this was the earliest documented cemetery in the Americas, or might be among them. Would that have been the first documented autopsy in the Americas as well?
Yes. At this point, that's my understanding. We had a forensic archaeologist named Tom Christ, who directed the field work, although there was a team of others, and I think that was also an international team that were involved at different times. We certainly had Canadian representation in all of the forensic archaeological work. And cool. I should mention that I thought we had a bad winter this go around. They had a really bad winter, and they just basically picked up their buildings and moved out. I sort of wish I could do that now, in fact. But the houses that they built were most likely prefabs that had been sort of assembled and then disassembled in France, loaded aboard the ship, constructed on St. Croix Island, and then they were taken down and moved to Port Royal, now part of Nova Scotia, and that was the next settlement. And so basically at that point, 1605, same individuals, at least the survivors, same buildings, with the exception of the storehouse, which apparently was so large, and most likely there was a need for such a building in support of perhaps the fur trade later on. And it was, in fact, used by a trader named Jean Platrier, and until about 1613. Just to mention what happened to St. Croix Island settlement, well, this was driving the English down in Virginia crazy, the very notion that Frenchmen were beginning to settle the far northern reaches of what they thought was their territory. So an enterprising individual named Samuel Ardell sailed up from Virginia just to destroy these, kind of flimsy buildings. But I guess he took some satisfaction in doing that. So in the fall of 1613, he burned this structure, and in doing so, maybe helped to preserve it, because that's something that came through pretty clearly in the archaeological exercise in the 1790s, and then in the 1960s. It was really the only building that had a coherent stone foundation that could be mapped.
Very cool. So in addition to the French occupations, David Sanger's got a chapter in the appendix of the book that discusses Indigenous life on the island. And so what do we know about Indigenous French interactions and a little bit about the Indigenous archaeology on the island?
Well, that's a really good question. And I don't mean to leave the Native Americans out of the story, because they certainly were a part of it from the very beginning. As part of the Quality region, including the Passamaquoddy and Cusp Bays and offshore islands and tidal rivers, that's sort of the framework for looking at St. Croix Island. And this is an island probably never had the diversity of food resources of the mainland and larger islands. More likely, it was probably served as an overnight camping area for expeditions along the river. Based on his analysis of the artifacts from the island, David Sanger concluded there was probably nothing contemporaneous with the arrival of the French colonists. Rather, the pre-contact period artifacts dated from about 3400 to about 1650 years ago, so before the present. So those groups were long gone by 1604, but that doesn't mean that Native Americans weren't there. This is just, and we have to factor in the erosion that took place in the island. We also have to factor in the human disturbance of the island by the lighthouse keeper and others in later years. Getting back to Sanger, though, for the earlier sites, there are two types of artifacts: lithics, or stone tools, and byproducts of making stone tools and maintaining them, and ceramic artifacts, or pottery. The stone tools appear to represent the earliest, what was called terminal archaic materials from the region, dating somewhere between about 2,700 to 3,400 years ago. The ceramic artifacts are of more recent age, dating to between maybe 2,100 years to 1,600 years ago. It was interesting, up to 38 different ceramic vessels were represented by the pottery sherds. So there was a kind of a definite use of the island at that time. More evidence for shell middens was expected based on comparative sites in the region I described earlier. There was evidence for year-round occupation detected nearby, but St. Croix Island was probably used mainly during the summer months, and erosion may have destroyed much of the shell midden evidence.
And so, speaking of erosion, St. Croix Island's an International Historic Site, and I imagine that introduces both management benefits and management challenges, and has implications for the archaeological work. Could you talk a little bit about that, along with just sort of what kind of threats the site's experiencing and how they're being managed?
Okay, well, I do want to remind ourselves that the Passamaquoddy Nation apparently accepted a French presence there and hunted and traded with them, although there were long absences of French settlers per se. Traders, of course, fishermen were almost always around there. That, getting back to our report, there's a chapter by Donald Soctama of the Passamaquoddy tribe where he describes what he feels is important about this site and about interactions with the French, and reminds us that there was sort of quite a bit of interaction among Wabanaki Indians who actually went to France and who were received by the king at that time, and who also married into French royalty. Also, he reminds us that Passamaquoddy men served with honor in World War I and World War II. And this gets back to the wonderful sort of expansive notion of what constitutes a significant site in France now, going up to World War II, where some shelters, World War I shelters, I think they were, had actual sort of inscriptions left by Passamaquoddy soldiers over in France. So,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. And, these are areas that, could certainly stand to be further pursued.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about this probably with our sort of question about Port Royal, but in general, the French had overall better relations with Wabanaki peoples than other European powers, and in particular the British following the French.
Yeah, well, I would say so. And it's important to certainly respect the Passamaquoddy Nation in, I think, any decisions made about St. Croix Island. It's been sort of like a fact. It's an incredibly important part of the landscape, and has been used quite clearly for thousands of years. I think that when the National Park Service conducts more sort of archaeological survey work in areas threatened by erosion, that some of this shell midden evidence will probably come to light. It's a challenging area to use geophysics to try and detect subsurface features because of the underlying bedrock configuration, not too far from the surface. And we certainly tried to use that, among other things, to locate additional graves, but it was a challenge. And we had some very good people doing geophysics there. So, but again, I think that it's important to protect all the sites, but Native American sites, I'd say pretty clearly there are many that are in this area of these threatened areas along the shoreline. I could say a little bit more about this project, making this the first historical archaeology project in North America.
And that way, this way, I'll be reminded again. My spouse just immigrated this weekend and did so through Calais, and that's the reason she had to go through Calais, I guess. Further in, so we'll let you tell the listener about how we figured this out.
Yeah, well, as it turned out, the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 used a 1755 Mitchell map of the Bay of Fundy to define what the international boundary should be between Maine and, at that time, Nova Scotia, as being the St. Croix River, described extensively by Champlain during the time spent at St. Croix Island. And there were long lulls when Europeans were kind of kept a low profile there. And in fact, the name of that river was forgotten by Europeans, and it was renamed the Scoodic River. And so when the Americans were trying to set the boundary, it was sort of up for grabs which was the river that Champlain had actually referred to in his book, because there was no St. Croix River of historic memory left in that part of in that boundary zone. So the Americans claimed that a river nearly 30 miles further east was the ancient St. Croix River. And I have a hard time pronouncing the name of that river. Maybe you could do it.
The Macadavic?
Yes.
Yeah.
And here's again, in red, it shows the international border, and the alternate river, that's up there, okay? And here's the St. Croix River down here. So that would have made a huge difference, especially to the British residents of St. Andrews, who, based on the understanding that the St. Croix River was, St. Croix River had settled St. Andrews, and they didn't want to pick up. These were British loyalists from further south. So a lot was kind of hanging on this historical question that could not be resolved by historic sources alone. Certainly comparisons were made between some of Champlain's maps of the area, showing some continuity in some of the landforms and so forth. But to clinch it, the commissioners, there are 3 commissioners who were appointed to resolve this issue, that they came up with the idea of going out with shovels. I think they hired people with shovels. They were respectable citizens themselves.
They were bird hunting while this all went.
Yeah, exactly.
They were doing all the heavy lifting academic work on the job.
Yeah.
But in any case, went out to this island that seemed to be key to deciding whether it was located within the St. Croix River or not. So they unearthed piles of rubble corresponding with 4 building sites shown in Champlain's map, and they also found artifacts, including pottery, in enough quantity and detail so that some of that stuff is identifiable today based on their kind of verbal descriptions. And next, the Surveyor General of Prince Edward Island, Thomas Wright, took a special interest in the project, and he cleared away debris from a rectangular foundation that seemed to correspond with this storehouse, this enduring storehouse out there. And he noticed brick chimney rubble and found more pottery among different piles. Now, he described the distance separating these piles and the foundation, which he had measured. I took those measurements and drew a map. I could draw a map with them and laid that over the site map. and pretty much seems to correspond with what Champlain was describing there. So based on this evidence, the commission was convinced that, in fact, this was St. Croix Island based on the presence of this settlement. Also, a little sort of a whiff of dendrochronology is present as well in this research expedition, because they noted that some really old-looking trees were growing on top of these foundations. So it's this kind of notion of superposition that, more recent stuff is sitting on top of older stuff.
And the island at the time, so the river was Scudic, and the island at the time was known as Docus. Docus Island, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Docus. There's different pronunciations, but Docus, Docus. So there was no direct link, at least linguistically, to St. Croix Island. But anyway, that was reestablished, river renamed St. Croix River. And now, with all these people digging things up, did this mess up the site? Well, quite possibly. But I would tend to think that as soon as they found compelling evidence, they would have packed up their shovels and gone back home. But I guess in my opinion, there's erosion, which definitely has taken some bites around the edge of the island. I took the historic sources that seemed to depict an outline of the island, and the outermost edge here is from a Champlain period map, and the inner orange, or the internal orange, that's the island as it is today. So it clearly has lost a substantial amount, especially towards, this is more exposed to this open ocean itself. So clearly erosion has taken a toll. But another thing has to do with this, which is not so great photograph of the lighthouse that was built on the island in the 1850s. And this lighthouse, as most buildings did at that time period, had a cellar. And I'm willing to bet I know where those stones and even brickwork used in that cellar came from, as a principle of least effort alternative to bringing it across the river, that they could find this material just sitting around. Right. And they may well have dug up the foundations from the 1604 settlement.
Interesting.
You mentioned you have the Champlain season at St. Croix, and then they pack up the prefabs and they head for Port Royal. And this is some of what you're working on next, I gather. And we'd love to have you back when some of your work on that comes out. But could you give us kind of a sneak preview of where that work's heading?
Yes. Well, it was. There are some interesting Canadian and American links. Again, mainly in the individuals who took an interest in these sites and followed up by doing research, regardless of which side of the boundary they fell upon, because they're part of a sort of a longer narrative of French colonization and the impact on Native Americans and on other groups, other European groups as well who were present. Quite clearly, the English were quite perturbed by all this, and there's a history of English destruction of French sites not long after they were built. And so a coherent sort of geographical region to look at this area does include, not only Bay of Fundy, but moving up, and Port Royal was the successor site to St. Croix Island. The buildings were moved there. We have an engraving by Champlain, of course, showing these buildings reconfigured into a settlement that is not like the open settlement at St. Croix Island, but rather more like a fortification, more like a fort, and even with cannon mounted, pointing outwards towards the river or the bay. So it would be important to take the updated information from St. Croix Island and then to compare it with what really was not found at Port Royal, because I'm not the first archaeologist to call attention to this, but there were no early artifacts unearthed at the Port Royal site, which was excavated by an American archaeologist and largely funded by an American woman from the Boston area who took an interest in this project. So the question remains, what happened to Port Royal? If it's not where the reconstruction is located, then there are a couple implications. One, of course, being that it's not where the reconstruction is, and the other is that it may be elsewhere and possibly threatened by erosion or something else going on. So that's sort of the challenge, and it makes sense to work with our Canadian counterparts. It's because it's a great sort of international mystery, well worth pursuing. So.
That's terrific. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah, so there's this kind of a potential for future major discovery of where the actual Port Royal was.
Exactly. It was destroyed in an English raid not too long after it was built. Of course, Champlain and Degas focused on Quebec, or what's now Quebec City. And so that's where the story picks up. So it's an ongoing narrative that has very significant documentation and very significant archaeology. And so we have some really very good work done in Quebec City itself. I say this not only as a former sort of, I guess, faculty or staff person at University of Laval, but they've had a long history of compliance archaeology that has had the ultimate respect for, these sort of post-medieval period remains. So, and yes, they do follow Champlain to a large extent, but the fact of the matter is that French settlement did follow in his footsteps, so to speak, and continued on westward. So both Port Royal and Quebec City are part of that story.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Steve, for joining us to talk about this topic. I think our listeners are going to be interested in this one. There's you've got a constant interest in St. Croix.
Yeah, fascinating conversation, and I think with Port Royal too, I think we should jump into the when we talk about it, the sort of the idea of forgetting about these places and forgetting the place names and how those records got lost in the intervening years. That's a fascinating thread to pull on. So. Thank you so much.
Because now down here in the United States, we're experiencing the 250th anniversary of 1776, and it's an interesting sort of article on the overall topic of these types of observations in the New Yorker magazine not long ago. But each kind of anniversary takes on a different form, and fortunately, in earlier years, that often took the form of increased funding for research on critical sites, and that I think those of us who are around for the American bicentennial certainly jumped on that. This year, I have to say, and I wouldn't want this as part of the recorded interview here, but you never know these days. But it seems a little bit sort of counterintuitive that patriotism would be sort of supposedly the primary concern right now in this country. And yet the resources for professional study of some of these critical sites where these events took place, and which have become some of our most important tourist sites, that funding hasn't really been forthcoming, and the creativity, the imagination that happened during the bicentennial. Could it be because those staff members are no longer employed by federal and state agencies? So that's a tough question, but this is the time to explore it. And you can see how archaeology and history have always played an important role there.
Yeah. This was fun, Steve. I appreciate talking to you. It was good to meet you, too.
Well, likewise, I'm glad this worked out.
Well, Ken, I think it's time for hit pieces.
I think it is. So, Gabe, on this one, we are steering away from St. Croix and historical archaeology. We're actually going to highlight a hit piece of hit pieces. And so this is in the most recent SAA archaeological record, March 2026. So this is the volume 26, number 2. There is a whole section called Publishing Regional Journals in the Americas, Surviving or Thriving. And it's edited by Sarah A. Herr and Maria Gutierrez. And what it is basically editorial boards and editors of different journals, including the Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology, the Plains Anthropologist, and a few others, including Revista del Museo de Antropologica, and so some global cases. It looks like Peruvian and possibly, I don't know where the Revista is published, maybe Mexico?
I'm not sure.
Either way, it's kind of an interesting overview of the challenges and prospects of publishing, in particular, smaller journals, and so these regional journals. And Gabe, as the incoming president of a regional society that publishes a regional journal, what is your take on this?
Well, I think, I think, Ken, that honestly, we've sort of had this discussion substantially lately, because we're always deciding where to send stuff we're writing, right? And there's I think a tension here a little bit with some of the stuff we talked with Matt Betts about, right? Which is that one of the great things about these regional journals is they still actually will mostly publish pretty big data-heavy papers.
Yeah.
The other thing, speaking for the Eastern States Archaeological Federation, or not speaking for them, but from the perspective of the Eastern States.
Did you hear that, Youssef? This is your voice coming through the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast.
Exactly. These regional journals are some of the best vessels for publishing CRM work. Well, and ESAF even has some basically scholarships to help support that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so, so this is interesting. I will admit I haven't read all the articles in here, but I'm involved with the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, which, although it is national in scope, is in some ways kind of a regional journal because it's focused on Canadian archaeology, which tends to be I would imagine probably our membership is larger than some of these regional societies, but probably smaller than some of them. I would imagine
that's right.
Like Southwest or Southeast archaeology societies might be on par with the membership of the Canadian Archaeological Association.
Probably true.
So the readership of these journals is probably a pretty similar scope, and so. Yeah, so it's interesting to see this coming out. I encourage you. I believe the SA ARC record is always open access.
I think that's right.
And so the listener can probably click the link in the show notes and have a look at that article if you are interested in it, or if you are actually. Do you know what's funny? I'm just looking at the splash page here, Gabe, to interrupt myself. That they actually do include. The United States regional journals include Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology, Journal of California and Great Basin, Plains Anthropology, Kiva, the Journal of Southwestern Anthropology and History, Southeast Archaeology, Northeast Anthropology, and Northeast Historical Archaeology. Canadian journals include the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, the Midden, and North Atlantic Archaeology. AENA doesn't appear to have made the list.
Well, that's interesting.
So...
It seems like an error.
I think it is. Anyway, encourage you guys to check that out, and I think I will. This will probably be some of my May reading things.
Mine too. I'm actually just waiting for the hard copy to arrive.
Yeah. I don't have the hard copy yet. I've got I get the email that the PDF has come out. So.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Ken, this is just a reminder to the listener to send us a image of the receipt for donating to the CAA Scholarship Fund, $25 or more, and we will get you an apron.
Yeah, and a reminder too, friends of the show, interested listeners, and anybody who is going to be going to the Canadian Archaeological Association meeting, we are doing a live podcast. And so Thursday, May 7th at 7 to 9 p.m. at the Grizzly Paw Pub. That's in downtown Canmore. It's not the one across from the Conference Hotel. It is a free event. We would ask that you RSVP through the Canadian Archaeological Association's conference website, but it's also not mandatory to RSVP. It's just so we have an idea of numbers. And it's going to be a fun night of interesting interviews, some prizes, and just kind of a fun opportunity to meet some of the listeners and meet some new folks, and maybe even some local Canmorians. I don't know if that's what they go by, or Canmorites. Maybe we should establish this before we do the show.
We could ask at the show. We could put it to a vote. I understand that they're liking to put things to referenda in Alberta.
I'd like to find a Mike from Canmore. Do you remember that skit? Yeah.
Well, I don't exactly remember the skit, except that Trevor actually mentioned it to me the other day.
Yeah. So you should look it up. It's the Royal Canadian Air Force used to do this skit, Mike from Canmore. And when my parents lived out here in the 1970s, my dad talks about that, like, that is an accurate depiction of, Canmore was a pretty small outpost basically in the foothills. And now it's, as you'll find out here in a couple of weeks, Gabe, it is a rather upscale, a pretty happening spot these days. So.
Yeah, I'm bringing my dress spurs.
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, good. All right, Ken. Well, I will talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk to you soon, listener.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reinick and Ken Holyoke.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast is brought to you every fortnight by the Association of Professional Archaeologists of New Brunswick. Funding and support is provided by Social Sciences Humanities Research Council grants, University of New Brunswick and University of Lethbridge.
Ken Holyoke.
Research by Gabe Reinick and Ken Holyoke. Production is handled by audio engineer Emmanuel Kell. Video production by Cody Pye. The music is composed by Justin Hankey. The music remixed by Emmanuel Kell. And Hakuna Rada by Shane Dell. Find us on Instagram at _New Brunswick _archaeology, on LinkedIn, and on the web at newbrunswickarchaeology.com.